Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar. We see there are still some people joining, so we'll give it just another minute until we get started.
Hey guys, really excited to be here.
For those that are already here, if you want to drop in the chat where you're calling in from, we can see where everyone's joining from today. Ooh, Calgary, Dallas, welcome. Phoenix, thanks for joining, Miranda. I myself
North
am located in
America
San Francisco.
represent.
Yeah, where are you at, Sam?
I'm here in Denver, Colorado.
Nice.
Very snowy out here today, so everyone pray for me.
So it begins, right?
So it begins. That's what I get for living in Colorado in November. It's going to snow. I feel like Dallas and Phoenix probably have that a little bit easier than me, but Calgary, I bet you know what I'm talking about.
Yes, us San Francisco folk cry when it gets just below 60. It's just a little too cold for us.
That's true. Well, at the top of those hills, sometimes it can get like 55. Like that's pretty scary weather up there.
I do swear it is colder than it feels. It's not just us.
Well, we're going to give it just one more minute here before folks can kick off.
Yes, looks like we have some excitement for 5 tips for support operations leaders. Good timing for going into the end of the year and into the new year.
Yeah, performance review season is coming up before too long, so hopefully these tips are coming at just the right time. Yep, I'm just going to give it till 3 after, and then we can kick in. Sorry for triggering you, Jess. I really should have given the performance review trigger warning.
They're like laundry. As soon as they end, they just begin again.
That is so true. It really is a cycle.
Yes.
All right. Well, it is now 3 minutes after, so folks will certainly continue to trickle in, but we're just going to go ahead and get the party started.
Yes, thank you everyone for joining. Glad you could make it to our webinar today. We will be talking about how to win at customer support operations, and that will include 5 tips for support operations leaders. My name is Lindsay Merrimon. I'm on the marketing team here at Assembled, and I'm joined by my colleague, Sam Dehart, who is the product community manager at Assembled, very closely entwined with the product and a lot of our customer community members. We're so lucky to have her join us today, talk about some of the things that she hears in the field, what she's seen. She also has a previous life as a workforce manager herself, so has a lot of firsthand knowledge and experience. We're really lucky to be hearing from Sam today.
Awesome.
Just to kick things off, I'll go through a quick agenda. We'll talk about a couple of housekeeping things while everybody is joining here, and then we'll definitely jump into the 5 tips, go through all 5 of them in pretty in-depth, and then we will leave some time at the end for questions and answers. So anything you guys have that you want to ask while we have Sam here, we will definitely get time to do that. All right. So as you're joining, definitely share your name, where you're calling in from. We love to see everybody that's joined, where they're from. And then if you can notice the question tab on your screen here, that's where you can drop questions and answers in there, and we'll be monitoring it as we go along. And again, save time at the end for questions and answers. This always gets asked. We are recording the session, and we will be sharing the recording after the event. So they should get sent to your inbox that you registered with within 24 hours, give us, after the event is concluded. And then if you don't see it, be sure to check your junk and spam folders, because sometimes they land in there. They do come from the system. So if you're not seeing them, check there before you come asking for us. If not, we're always happy to share them as well. So with that, we can go ahead and dive into our 5 tips. So thank you, Sam. We'll go ahead and get really started.
Awesome. Thank you, Lindsay. And I really don't think I could introduce myself any better than Lindsay's already done. But for folks that don't know me, hello. I'm Sam, and I'm our product community manager here at Assemble. One of my favorite things about my role as a product community manager here is I really get to hang out a lot with our customers of all stripes, customers big, customers small, at all different kinds of kind of scales of organization. So it's a really good vantage point for just getting to really see and understand what's going on out there for folks. And then, as Lindsay mentioned, I also, in a prior life, was a support operations manager myself over at Imperfect Foods, originally doing all of this stuff out of a spreadsheet, but then my team hit around 80 people, started pulling my hair out, probably a familiar story to everyone here. And I ended up rolling out Assembled to my team, which is how I met the folks here back in the day and came on over. So that's a little bit about me and my background, but really excited to chat with you guys today about some of the tips I've observed from the field. And just one quick moment here while I take a quick coughing break. I have a little cold. One second. All right, now that I've dealt with that frog in my throat. So, my very first tip here is it's very important to know your data inside and out. And I know that this tip might seem like kind of a no brainer to a lot of folks, but I think the really important thing to chat about here is like, what data do I mean? And also, like, how does this exactly manifest? So, one of the common pitfalls I tend to see folks fall into earlier in their career, earlier in the scaling of an organization, is a lot of the times how you end up kind of being the first support manager that might be kind of helping figure out the stuff for an organization. Is a lot of the times you might be the person that's kind of the go to guy for responding to customer questions. You provide a really great customer experience time and time again. But those skills that make you a really great customer support agent for working through customer problems will very relevant, may not always be the same skill set that's going to make you a great operations leader, specifically when it comes to data. And what I mean by that is instead of focusing on kind of an individual customer interaction, being able to take those stories that customers are giving you or things that you're seeing in your data and really write them large. So instead of focusing just on individual customer interactions or how things are performing with those like individual tickets, really being able to look at those tickets holistically and think, hey, what's going on? What are the broader insights I can report back to the business from this? And just as an example, more concretely, of what this might look like, something that I've seen, one quick second here. Something that I've seen in a lot of growing support organizations is a need to simply identify, hey, where are the big problem areas that people keep writing into us about consistently? How does that rate against the other kinds of issues people have that they're sending into us? And if you can identify things like, oh, hey, well, actually 30% of our contact volume is coming from this one particular issue, that can then become a great argument for going upstream to solve those issues internally, or potentially create new processes to solve those at scale, like macros or AI solutions. So I think what really moves you from being kind of a day-to-day team lead type leader to being able to really support your team's operations is thinking about the data holistically, being able to kind of identify issues based off of that. And then, of course, kind of report back to the team. Here's the data for why I'm focusing on X, Y, or Z. And even better, here's the data for how effective that solution I created was. So even backing into this example a little bit further, let's say you do identify that 20% of all of your incoming volume is coming from just this one issue. And then how you might solve for that with your team is maybe creating some kind of macro to be able to easily respond to those kinds of inquiries, or perhaps even going a step further and solving for it upstream with the product that you're working on. Lots of different ways to skin a cat there, but it's even better to be able to, after you've solved a problem like that, go back and say like, hey, 20% of all of our contact volume was on this issue before. And thanks to this work that I've done, we've knocked it down to 10% this quarter. Or another way you might think about measuring that is something like tickets about this subject matter used to take us a 10-minute average handle time, and now they're down to 5 minutes. So lots of different ways to think about efficiency here. But I would just very much recommend knowing your ticket data and then being able to make change based on that and measure effectiveness in data as well using those metrics. So that's definitely one major tip I see from the trenches. Lindsay, if you wouldn't mind turning the page here. Thank you. So this actually, I'd say, goes really hand in hand with that knowing your data step. And I think for a lot of people, this is actually the concrete step that might take you from being somebody that's more interacting with customers day to day, perhaps as an agent or a team lead, into broader career opportunities, maybe as a leader on the support team more globally or in the operations side. This oftentimes is really the tip that can make the difference. And once again, that's kind of taking those data insights to identify and work to solve org level problems. So going back to that same example we were chatting about with knowing your data, perhaps once you've kind of gotten that grasp on your data, you realize, hey, 20 or 30% of our ticket volume just goes back to this one issue. Or maybe you identify that there's certain bits of feedback that customers are giving consistently about your product that just isn't very well documented anywhere because perhaps there's just not a great process around those things. Like lots and lots of different examples of how this can happen. But your support tickets are actually often going to be kind of your most direct lifeline of communication with your customer, just given that honestly, like a customer writing into support for many products out there, that might be the only time you're actually hearing directly from your customers. And being able to take the information you get out of those tickets more holistically to identify problems with the product or problems with your processes and then solve for that is really huge. So an example of this that I've actually worked with somebody on is I was working with a direct to consumer product team that basically was selling a product that goes to people's homes. Like I won't get super specific here, but think about something like a mattress, for example. And basically what happened is this mattress that was arriving for people, a lot of the times everything was going well and they weren't hearing anything bad about that. But they started noticing a recurring trend of people basically writing in that their mattress had a very specific flaw to it. And from that process of basically identifying, hey, like we've gotten 20, 30 tickets about this in the last couple of days, they actually identified that there was a problem at the manufacturing plant that was making these mattresses, that they then got the chance to go back to the team, report, and basically say, like, we need to recall this certain set of products and we need to solve this problem in our factories. And these are things that you really wouldn't notice if you didn't have somebody with their ear to the ground looking at these tickets as they're coming in, identifying those trends that become org level problems, and then reporting that back up into other areas of the business. That way they can be solved. And it's catching things like that, or in some cases, if you can even find a solution for something like that internal to the support org, that often kind of come up during performance review season, not to trigger anyone. I know that those are coming up. So definitely an important skill set to keep in mind is just, hey, what trends am I noticing in my tickets that might be important to the business or other areas of the business that I'm not as immediately involved in? And then kicking that ball forward. Alrighty, go ahead and turn the page, Lindsay. So getting a little bit more into the weeds here, which is always my favorite place to be as an ops person, I do recommend that whenever you're goal setting, really start by measuring yourself before actually setting the goals. And I know that this seems really intuitive, but for a lot of teams, I've found it's actually often kind of a major challenge with starting out, especially if maybe you're trying to set goals for things that you've never really measured before. Like my bread and butter tends to be more in the workforce management and operations side of the house. So a really common metric, of course, I tend to hear a lot about on the ground is adherence. And I can't tell you how many times I've worked with teams that set their adherence goal kind of arbitrarily. And they might say, like, oh, well, at my last org, we had a 95% adherence goal. So that's going to be our goal. Or sometimes I also even see people say, like, oh, well, I want a 100% adherence goal. And for folks that have been in the space for a little while, I know hearing 100% adherence goal probably raises some alarm bells already. But for a lot of people that have maybe not measured this before, their kind of go-to instinct is like, oh, well, I want this number to be as high as it possibly can be, which for some of these metrics is 100. But when you're thinking about support metrics, like things like adherence or CSAT, like 100 may not be a very attainable goal or also a very cost-efficient goal, depending on the metric that you're aiming for. So effectively, like aiming for 100%, it's kind of a great thing, an aspiration. And of course, we all always want to be as high as possible, but it might not be where you want to set that initial goalpost. Or for a lot of teams, 100% just may not be an attainable metric in general for a lot of the metrics support teams measure on. So I highly recommend, if you have this knee-jerk reaction to move to 100% for the goal, I would just kind of put that back on the shelf for now. The other thing I see people do besides just throwing out 100% as the goal they're aiming for is often, once again, people will kind of just arbitrarily pick a goal position. And that might be based on like, oh, well, in my last org, this was the number that we went for. Or like, oh, I read a book and this is what it says the average is. Or just, well, 90% is an A. So I want an A. Like, there's a lot of arbitrary places you could draw a line in the sand for a goal. And I really find a lot of people kind of set themselves up for failure, either aiming for this arbitrary goal or aiming for 100%, which I guess is also another kind of arbitrary goal. And then they always end up kind of looping back around being like, oh, hey, why am I consistently not hitting my goal? But then also not realizing always like goals are something that are kind of always subjectively set for each org. So really, as an org, you can put that needle wherever you would like it to be. So your A plus could be different than another person's A plus, and that's okay. So just remember, like, goals are meant to be unique to each organization out there. They're not meant to be one size fits all. They're not meant to always be 100%. But backing into more, I guess, kind of the concrete advice of the tip, I think the natural next question is kind of like, well, hey, Sam, if it's not supposed to be 100%, it's not supposed to be 95%, what number should I be thinking about? And the answer really is think about where your team is today. And that's really where you should start benchmarking from. So usually when I'm working with teams, for example, that have never used a workforce management solution before, which once again tends to be where I'm most in the weeds, is on that workforce management side of the house. So thinking about things like SLA, adherence, all of those moving pieces. When I'm having those initial conversations with people, I really encourage them to gather your adherence data for 2 weeks, a month, like whatever time frame feels comfortable for you. But gather that information before you start making kind of major changes or setting concrete goals so you know what you're working with. And a lot of the times, by the way, I also find people get in the door and then that initial number might be way lower than whatever you're thinking it is because you're assuming that people are on task maybe more often than they are. That's another thing a lot of people often find when you first start measuring this stuff is it might look a little different than what you were thinking. But that's an aside for another day. But certainly a lot of meat I could get into there too. But I encourage you guys to look at what the numbers actually are for at least a few weeks, if not a little bit longer than that. Look at that average and then kind of think about, is that average what I would like the benchmark to be? Or do I want to improve on where we're at? And for most people, you're going to want to improve on where you're at unless people are, magically already at a really high, happy place before you've even started doing kind of the actual groundwork here. But it's not at all uncommon for people to first measure this with adherence in particular and see something around like 60 to 70% as kind of that first round of, hey, this is where my team team's at for adherence right now. And if that's you, maybe consider making your first goalpost just 5 or 10% above whatever you're already pacing at. So if the team is pacing at 75%, but you feel like you want to be at 95%, that's great, but maybe your first goal should be 80%. And then I think the last thing to keep in mind here is this isn't an end all be all, and this needle can constantly be moving. So a year from now, maybe your goal will be 85 or 90% once your team understands how to, take action on adherence insights. Once you have these processes in place and your agents are used to it, like, yeah, maybe at that point the goal is 95%. But I just recommend, move that up quarter over quarter. It doesn't have to be kind of a one and done thing. Like a very common, very successful path I've seen people take is maybe your first goal is 80%. Next quarter, you're going to bump that up to 85, next quarter, 90. And then before you know it, you're already having kind of top metrics for the business without, having to necessarily kind of jar your whole team with these sudden goals or feeling like you're just not capable of hitting a goal that maybe was kind of arbitrarily set and unrealistic to begin with. So that'll be better for both your actual goal attainment and morale, in my personal opinion. And then, by the way, just because even though I always say this, that when you're setting your goals, you should look back and measure where you're at, and that's how you should do it. I almost always get the question, yeah, Sam, that's really great, but I really want to know what the industry average is for adherence. That way I can benchmark myself against that. And you heard it here first, folks. That secret number is 83%. So if you're curious about what adherence percentage is most common across all of our teams, the number is around 83% on average. So if you're measuring adherence above 83%, congratulations, you've actually beat the industry average. If it's below 83%, maybe we could wiggle that up a little bit. So anyway, those are some of my quick tips with goal setting, but especially adherence, just because that's my bread and butter. All right, very similarly, plan for the team you have, not the team you want. And I will also tell you guys, this is a very, I'd say, very useful skill for managing up as well. I'm not sure if anyone here, actually, probably everyone here has. I think it's a pretty universal experience, but I'm not sure if anyone here has ever been having like a staffing and planning conversation with perhaps a director or somebody else that you're reporting into. And then you say you need one number, and then they're just like, oh, well, if they were performing at this rate, we would need this number. So how about we go with this number instead? And a lot of the time, the number that will be pitched back to you is basically like, oh, well, if everyone were at our goal of solving 10 tickets per hour, this is the head count I think we would need. And solving 10 tickets per hour is the goal. So let's go ahead and slot that much head count. And I know this can be a really tough conversation to have internally, because I think a lot of the times it can kind of go against expectations that other people in the org might have. But I would say it's very important to plan for the team you have and not the team you want. So what that means to me is when you're thinking about things like, how many people do I need to hire? Usually how that math starts is you're looking at how much contact volume is going to be coming in. And if you're using Assembled, you might also be just looking at our staffing calculations for how many people we say you need based on how many contacts are coming in and your configurations. But I'll leave the Assembled specifics on the side for a minute. But basically, usually how these conversations go is, well, I'm expecting this much contact volume. I'm loosely expecting my team to be able to perform in this specific way. So therefore, we need this many people. Where the math, I think, often gets kind of messy is people will be doing their assumptions based on goals. So it'll basically be like, oh, well, if our whole team hits this certain amount of solves per hour and this adherence goal, then this is how many people we need. But that whole plan really falls apart if your team isn't actually hitting the goals that you set. So if your team doesn't actually hit that solves per hour you're considering in the calculation, or if they don't kind of hit that adherence goal and your shrinkage is more than you were expecting, you are going to end up in a world where you're not hitting your SLA and you're not hitting your like global top line metrics. And then a lot of the times down the line, that becomes a leadership conversation of just like, oh, hey, well, we met our staffing goal, so why are we not hitting our SLA? And the answer might be that the staffing goal was set assuming that people were going to perform to the goal, when in reality, they performed in a different way. So, in addition to setting your goals very realistically, I also recommend when you're making your assumptions for planning, be sure to plan around whatever your team's averages actually are and not what they are aspirationally. So, as an example, if your team does typically perform at 75% adherence and 5 solves per hour, but your goal is 90% adherence and 10 solves per hour, sounds like, there might be some needles to move on the goal side, but you also don't want to plan on waking up tomorrow with the perfect team that's hitting their goals if you want to have a team that's hitting their SLA. So that's a quick tip there, that a lot of folks kind of fall into this trap of like, oh, well, if I had this perfect team, I would need this many people and I would be following these processes. But you probably don't have a perfect team yet. So just keep that in mind as you're building. And Lindsay, if you wouldn't mind turning the page for me. Awesome. So, as I mentioned, you might not have the perfect team yet for kind of solving every gap in your business. And that's okay. Like, I think at pretty much every single org I've ever talked to, the current setup probably isn't perfect for attaining every goal that they have. And if it were, honestly, support operations people probably wouldn't have very much work to do, which would be sad for me. So this really is kind of our goal always, though, is to get the team to a place where they are consistently hitting goals that are realistic and keeping good care of your customers. And in addition to, those coaching opportunities to maybe level up on things like adherence or CSAT or solves per hour, or just throwing more bodies at the problem, like hiring new people. There's also other things that you can do to solve those gaps in your organization that, in my opinion, do also kind of fit within the support operations hat. I think that this is, kind of an emerging world of new concepts, like with off and near shoring, as well as AI and lots of other buzzwords in the industry. I think some people, especially in support operations world, don't always see those things as kind of one for one with kind of our standard support ops, which are more about kind of training the team and making sure that they have all the resources they need and everyone has all the coaching they need to keep up with metrics like adherence or SLAs, et cetera, et cetera. But in my mind, since the end goal of having well-oiled support operations is to always be hitting those goal SLA numbers, AI and BPOs and all of these other concepts do really kind of, in my opinion at least, fall neatly underneath this purview as well. So I highly recommend thinking about using technology or other strategies, like potentially bringing in a BPO, to plug the gaps between today and your ideal state. And that could also include more traditional strategies like training up folks on how to be in adherence, or training up folks on how to solve tickets more quickly, or adding in new macros, things like that just make folks move a little faster. So this could be a combination of kind of new strategies like AI and offshoring, as well as kind of old tried and true things like training and goal calibration. By the way, a little fun fact for you here. There's a lot of different things you can do to move the needle. Something I've been very consistently surprised by in my time helping people get up to speed with Assembled. Like we were talking about in the goal setting stage, a lot of people, when you're initially kind of opening the door to this stuff, your adherence might be 60, 70%. But it's really common that within like a month or two of just measuring this stuff and talking to people about this stuff, you might see a 5 or 10% jump in adherence just from having those training coaching-based conversations. So definitely take stock of those traditional strategies as well, like training and goal calibration. But another big area that you may not be thinking about is things like bringing in an AI partner to maybe deflect or take care of those easy tickets, or co-pilot with your agents. That way they can train up more quickly. Or, of course, also just pulling in new headcount from other sources like a BPO. So lots of things you can do to plug gaps between your today and your ideal state. Even if your team isn't ready to hit all those lofty goals yet, there's a lot of things you can do to help them amp up. So with that, I'll go ahead and pause here. I know that there's probably a lot of questions from folks. So we'll be moving into our Q&A. As Lindsay mentioned at the beginning, there's that handy questions button on the bottom, so do feel free to kick them in there.
Yeah, definitely. And we can go ahead and get kicked off. So one of the questions, workforce management can sometimes become sort of like a bad cop when team managers may want to be more lenient or create exceptions for agents. Do you have any advice for building alignment between workforce managers and team managers?
Oh boy, howdy do I.
Thought you might.
And probably no surprise for folks, especially if you're thinking about managing adherence for the first time. This is going to happen almost guaranteeably. It's a very, very common thing where basically you might start being like, okay, guys, we need to be aiming for 80% adherence. Or if I see you being out of adherence for 20 minutes, that's going to be some kind of team conversation, etc. And for teams that aren't used to thinking about adherence, that can be really jarring, kind of understandably. But there's a lot of things that you can do to ensure team alignment about these things. I would say that the big three in my mind are basically make sure that the goal you set feels realistic, because you don't want people to think that you're aiming for 100%. And by the way, that's usually a really common thing agents will say when they first look at their metrics is they're like, oh no, I went to go take a bathroom break and now my adherence is less than 100% and I'm totally freaking out. And because support agents are usually very like kind of AP kid minded, I want the A, I'm an overachiever, at least most of the support folks I know, seeing something below 100% can be scary. So I think it's important to communicate to the team, this is my goal for you guys. And this is a realistic goal in consideration of all of those little things that might happen, like needing to take a bathroom break or a call that runs over, etc. And that's a big part of the reason why I also recommend to admin teams never to measure to 100% and why I do feel it's unrealistic. But being sure to communicate with the team that, hey, we're not looking for perfection. We're not looking for you to be a robot. We're just looking to kind of keep this within a reasonable boundary. So that's one piece, is don't measure to 100% and be really clear with agents that you're not. Another big piece I would say is very clearly communicating what the goal is and why. So as an example, I think something that can be really helpful is explaining to the team like, hey, like it's not like I suddenly care about when you're going on your bathroom break or when you're catching up on your knowledge base or whatever any more than I did 2 months ago. The thing I care about is the thing I've always cared about, which is just making sure we're hitting our SLAs. And how we're going to make sure we're hitting our SLAs and delivering that really excellent experience to customers is by making sure that the plans that we have for how many people we need staffed stay as accurate as possible. Because, you know, if we're planning on you being in one place and you're somewhere else, all of a sudden the whole team misses the SLA. So I think just being really clear about what the goal is and why. And then finally, the last one is I see this time and time again whenever people start measuring adherence for the very first time. I almost guarantee you, if you're not measuring adherence right now, there are probably a handful of members of your team that are at like 90 or 90+% adherence already. And then there's probably going to be another segment of your team that's underperforming at 40 or 50% potentially. I almost guarantee it, if you start using a tool for the first time and start measuring adherence, that's going to be true. You're going to have high flyers and low flyers. But the problem with that is that means your high flyers are going to be taking way more of the contact volume than anyone else because they're just the ones that are available to do it. They're going to burn out faster. They're going to have a harder workday. So I think communicating with agents that a big part of why adherence matters is that way you can make sure people are evenly occupied and that, hey, if you're a high performer on the team, I don't want you to be occupied every moment of the day with a new ticket coming in because other people aren't in adherence. So measuring this also benefits them. But anyway, I could rant about this for a very long time. I actually think I have a blog post I wrote on our website about this somewhere like a year or two ago. Perhaps I'll find that and send that out. But that's a quick rant from me about my ideas there.
Love it. Thanks for the insight there. While we're on this technology slide here, you talked about using technology to bridge the gap in support ops. Are there signs it might be time to like build a team versus using technology in some of these areas?
Ooh, I have a few kind of favorite hallmarks here. So, one of mine is if you guys are getting a lot of tickets that are one or two touch tickets, that's actually a really good sign that you don't need to train new people. You just need to build new automations. And the reason why is because right now, as I'm sure all of you folks know, since we're all support people, there's things that AI is really good at, and then there's a lot of things that need a human touch that you probably don't want a robot to be handling for you, at least not right now. And for things that need that human touch, in my opinion, it's a lot of things that get more convoluted. So that would be things that are probably, like 5 or 6 messages deep. Yeah, you probably do want a real life human there working with that person. But if a lot of the contact volume that's coming in is just stuff like, how do I reset my password? That you're probably sending a help center article about anyway. Um, that's all good, kind of good fodder to know, like, hey, this is probably something that I could deflect or I could build a bot for, um, any of those kinds of things. And then we actually have a really great call out comment from Jess in the chat. But this is so true. If you use AI, do make sure your KPI is super dialed, or not KPI, sorry, too many buzzwords. Be sure your KB, or knowledge base for folks not in the know, is super up to date because typically your KB is where that bot will also be scraping that information from as well. So another good sign that your team might be ready for AI is also if you have that KB that's already built and documenting these things well, and it's more just needing to get that knowledge actually in your customer's hands quickly. Another really great sign that a bot would be helpful. Where I tend to think like bodies are the answer to the problem, and sorry, that's a very morbid way of saying that. What I mean when I say like humans are probably the answer to the problem, is probably situations where like a lot of that contact volume is once again, like 5 or 6 replies deep, or about a lot of things that you don't have thorough documentation on, which can also be pretty common for startups or like very technical products, things like that. It might make sense to have another person get involved. But those are some of my cues there. And actually, I guess one last one too is if you're consistently not hitting SLA or consistently in backlog, also probably a great time to investigate using a bot, just because you're probably in more of a hey, that can't hurt kind of phase. But that's my hot take.
Yes, definitely. And grading the bot, absolutely, Jess, and probably grading the tickets as well. Um, all right. So, Sam, do you have any tips on the best ways to communicate with cross-functional stakeholders who may have other priorities? Does it need to be a meeting? Are there other ways to effectively communicate that you typically employ?
Ooh, this is a great question. And honestly, I think the format here can really make all the difference, especially when a lot of the time the person you're pitching this to, they might be somebody that doesn't really get super in the weeds with this data very often. They might be a VP or director that maybe is even for a different department that might be kind of far away from the work you're doing day to day. And this is going to sound kind of sacrilegious considering I talk so much about getting out of your spreadsheets. And I do really believe in getting out of your spreadsheets for workforce management and scheduling. But there's also sometimes in some situations where, man, nothing really beats a good spreadsheet for being able to really get in there hands on with data and illustrate what's going on. So, one of my favorite things to do is basically take the data that I have and build it out into a sheet that's easily parsable, ideally with some conditional formatting and color coding. I'm a workforce management nerd, so of course I know my sheets, even though, of course I spend most of my time in Tool these days. Sheets can still be a really helpful communication tool for walking people through what you're seeing and the problems that you're identifying. So I usually like to create something like that in a sheet, or for folks that use like data analytics tools like Looker, that can be another great place for something like this. But basically, I take my data insights and I try to get the actual kind of raw information in some digestible format. And then I usually send over whatever I've kind of mocked up there with usually just a couple bullet points on my insights. Like, for example, something like, hey there, VP. As you can see, 30% of our contact volume in December was about this. Here's my idea for how we might solve for that. So like that's the 2 bullet points the exec's going to read. And then if they want to get more into the weeds, they have a spreadsheet or some other data source that they can hop into and start parsing it. So I usually like to start these things async with just a very pointed message about, hey, here's what I found, here's why it's important, because these people often don't have a lot of time. And then a little bit of information, kind of a little breadcrumb to where they could go if they really want to get deeper in it, which is the sheet. And then what I've actually found is a lot of the time when I do something like this, or other people that I'm working with do something like this, that then turns into the exec asking you for a meeting, which is always a really great feeling when they turn around and they're like, oh, hey, Sam, wow, this is really insightful. I just grabbed 30 minutes on your calendar so we can talk about this. And in my opinion, that's really where the key to the boardroom sits, is if you can get them to grab a meeting with you, talk it through, and then hopefully action on those insights. That's like really going to add some propane to the career fire that you're working on. I'm not sure if that metaphor made sense, but hopefully it did, you guys. Yeah, so that's my hot tip there.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for all the tips and advice and answering the additional questions. So with that, I think we're all through with all our questions today. So thank you so much, Sam, for all of your insights. Thank you, everybody on the line, for joining today. Hope you were able to get some value out of the session. I know I sure did. And again, be sure to keep an eye out for the follow-up recording if you are interested in reviewing the content again, sharing it with colleagues, however you might want to use it. So that will be in your inbox within a day or so. Thank you, everyone, and have a wonderful rest of your day.
Bye, guys. Thanks for coming by.